Hey, my name is Ethan Brooks. I'm 29 years old, and for the past 5 years I've been working as a paramedic in Harbor's Edge. This small rainy city tucked along the coast, where the fog sits low most mornings, and the streets always smell like salt and wet pavement after a storm. It's honest work, the kind that leaves your hands steady, but your mind carrying things you don't always talk about. Most shifts I'm out on calls helping people through the worst minutes of their lives. Car accidents on slick roads, elderly folks who fell in their kitchens, or the kind of medical emergencies that make you realize how fragile everything is. When I finally get home to my small apartment above the old laundromat, I usually just sit in the quiet for a while before I can even think about sleeping. The job pays the bills, but it doesn't leave much room for anything else. On my days off, I drive for a local rideshare company because the pay as a paramedic doesn't stretch as far as it should, and I've been telling myself for a while now that I'm saving up for something, even if I'm not exactly sure what that something is yet. I keep my head down, do the job, and try not to think too much about what's missing. Most weeks, the only thing I really look forward to is the few quiet hours I get to myself after everything is done. That was the plan anyway, until the night I found her wallet. It was a Thursday, the kind of evening where the rain came down in steady sheets, and the roads were slick enough that every call felt a little heavier than usual. I'd just finished a long shift at the station and decided to take a few rideshare jobs to make up some extra money. My last passenger was a woman near the hospital who had just visited a sick friend. She was distracted the whole ride, talking on her phone in a low, worried voice, barely looking up when I dropped her off at her building. I didn't think anything of it at the time. I just cleaned the back seat like I always do between jobs. But later, when I was wiping everything down under the glow of a streetlight, with the rain still tapping on the roof, I found a worn brown leather wallet wedged between the cushions. Inside was a driver's license for Clara Voss, age 27, with an address on Maple Street above a place called Root and Bloom. There was also a little pressed violet in one of the card slots and a faded photo of her standing next to an older woman who had the same warm, kind eyes. I could have just dropped the wallet at the police station or mailed it back, but something about that photo and the way the rain was still coming down hard made me decide to bring it back in person. It felt like the right thing to do, even if I couldn't explain exactly why at the time. When I pulled up in front of Root and Bloom, the lights were still on, even though the closed sign was flipped in the window. Through the big front glass, I could see rows of green plants on wooden shelves, hanging baskets full of trailing vines, and a small counter with a chalkboard menu that read, "Today's soup, creamy mushroom and thyme." The whole place looked warm and alive, even in the middle of a storm. I parked, walked up to the door, and knocked gently. A minute later, a woman came out from the back room, wiping her hands on a faded apron that had flour and soil smeared across the front. She had dark, wavy hair twisted into a loose bun, with a few strands falling around her face, a streak of dirt across one cheek, and the kind of tired but open expression that made you want to speak softly. She unlocked the door and looked at me, clearly surprised to see anyone there this late on a rainy night. "I only came to return her wallet," I said, holding it out before she could ask any questions. "You left it in my car earlier tonight. I'm Ethan. I was your driver for that last ride." Her eyes went wide when she recognized it. She took the wallet carefully, like it might disappear if she moved too fast. And for a long moment she just stared at it in her hands. I could see the relief wash over her face. Then she looked back up at me, and a small, genuine smile pushed through the exhaustion. There was something soft in her eyes that made the rain outside feel a little less cold. "Then stay for dinner," she said. I should have said no. It was late. I was still wearing my uniform under my jacket, and I didn't even know her last name until 5 minutes earlier. But there was something in the way she said it, not polite or forced, just simple and honest, like she really didn't want to eat alone that night, and maybe she could tell I didn't either. Before I could talk myself out of it, I nodded and stepped inside. She locked the door behind us and led me through the shop into a tiny kitchen tucked behind a beaded curtain. The air smelled like fresh herbs, warm bread, and damp soil. It felt like walking into someone's home rather than a shop. "I'm Clara," she said, glancing over her shoulder as she turned on a small lamp above the counter. And you really didn't have to come all the way here, in this weather. Most people would have just dropped it in the mail. It wasn't that far, I told her, and I figured you'd want it back tonight. There's a picture inside of you, and who I'm guessing is your mom. Didn't want that getting lost somewhere in the system. She paused for just a second, her back to me while she reached for a pot, and I saw her shoulders tighten the slightest bit before she turned around with a softer look. Thank you. Really, that picture means a lot. My mom passed 2 years ago. She's the reason I opened this place. I didn't know what to say to that, so I just nodded and watched as she moved around the small kitchen with easy familiarity. She had made a simple pasta with whatever she had on hand. Cherry tomatoes she'd grown herself in a little greenhouse out back, garlic, fresh thyme from one of the hanging pots, and a little goat cheese she crumbled over the top. It was the best meal I'd had in longer than I could remember. We sat at a small wooden table in the back of the shop, surrounded by hanging plants and the steady sound of rain on the tin roof. We talked like we'd known each other longer than an hour. She told me how she'd opened Root and Bloom after her mom passed, using what little inheritance there was to create a place where people could come in, slow down, breathe, and maybe leave with a plant or a warm bowl of soup. She said talking to the plants on quiet days helped her feel less alone, like she was keeping something alive even when everything else felt like it was slipping away. I told her about the calls that stay with you long after the shift ends, the ones where you do everything you can, and it still isn't enough. I didn't go into the worst details, but she listened like every word mattered. When I mentioned how the rain sometimes made the city feel heavier, she nodded and said the green things around her reminded her that growth could still happen even on the grayest days. After we finished eating, she asked if I minded helping her move a heavy bag of potting soil that had come in that afternoon. I said yes without thinking twice. We worked side by side in the back room under the warm light of a single bulb, and at one point our hands brushed when we both reached for the same trowel. Neither of us pulled away right away. When the bag was finally in place, she looked at me, dirt on her nose and a small smile on her face, and said, "You don't have to rush off if you don't want to." I was going to make tea. I stayed for the tea. And then I stayed a little longer after that, sitting on the old couch while she told me stories about regular customers who came in just to talk to the plants or sit quietly for a few minutes before heading back into their day. By the time I finally left, it was almost midnight, and the rain had slowed to a drizzle. I drove home thinking about the way her laugh sounded when she talked about the stubborn fern that kept trying to die on her and how she refused to give up on it. Over the next few weeks, I found myself stopping by Root and Bloom more often than I had any reason to. Sometimes, it was after a long shift, when I just needed somewhere quiet that didn't come that dulled short smell like hospitals and rain. Other times, I'd text her on my way home from a rideshare run just to see if she was still up. She always was. We'd sit on the old couch in the back room between shelves of monstera and snake plants, sharing whatever she'd baked that day or whatever takeout I'd picked up, talking about small things that somehow felt important. She had this habit of humming softly while she watered the plants in the evening, and I started looking forward to that sound more than I wanted to admit. One rainy afternoon I stopped by during her lunch break and ended up helping her repot a whole tray of seedlings that had arrived damaged from the supplier. We worked quietly together for almost 2 hours, and when we finished, she made us both grilled cheese sandwiches with tomato soup, and we ate them sitting on the floor because the table was covered in soil. She told me more about her mom that day, how her mom used to grow herbs in their tiny apartment kitchen even when money was tight, and how opening the shop felt like keeping a piece of her alive. I told her about the nights after particularly bad calls when I sat in my apartment staring at the wall because sleep wouldn't come. She didn't try to fix it or tell me it would get better. She just listened, and then reached over and squeezed my hand once, like she understood that sometimes words weren't enough. One night, after a rough call, where we lost a young guy in a motorcycle accident on the wet highway, I showed up at her door without texting first. It was almost 11, and the shop was closed, but the light in the back room was still on. She took one look at my face through the glass and pulled me inside without a word. She heated up leftover soup, put on that same old record that crackled softly in the corner, and made me sit on the couch while she cleaned up the last of the day's mess. We didn't talk about the call. She just sat next to me, close enough that our shoulders touched. And eventually, I let my head rest against hers. That was the night I knew I was in trouble. I was falling for her, and I hadn't even kissed her yet. The first time we kissed was on a quiet Tuesday, when the shop was closed early because of a bad storm. She was repotting a struggling fern a customer had brought in for advice, muttering softly to it like she always did. And I was sitting on the counter, watching her work and making dumb jokes about how she talked to plants like they were old friends who needed cheering up. She laughed and flicked a bit of moss at me. I caught her wrist gently to stop her, and the laughter faded into something quieter. She looked at me for a long moment, eyes searching mine like she was trying to decide if this was a mistake, and then she leaned in first. The kiss was slow and careful at the beginning, like we were both afraid the moment might break if we moved too fast. But when her hand slid up the front of my jacket and pulled me closer, something inside me settled into place for the first time in years. After that night, things felt different, in the best way. She started waiting for me after shifts. I'd walk in, still carrying the weight of whatever call I'd just left, and she'd hand me a clean towel and a mug of tea, without asking what happened. We spent evenings on that couch, or walking through the quiet streets after she closed up, her hand finding mine like it had always belonged there. She started teaching me the names of the plants and how to tell when they needed water or light, and I started telling her more about the parts of the job I usually kept to myself. She started hosting small community supper nights once a month in the shop, long tables set up, between the plants, simple food she cooked herself, neighbors and regulars sitting together talking about books or weather or whatever came up. I helped her set up the tables and string warm lights across the ceiling. Watching her move through the room, making sure everyone had enough to eat and felt welcome, made something in my chest ache in a way I hadn't felt in years. One night, after everyone had gone home and we were cleaning up together, I asked her what was on her mind because she'd been quieter than usual all evening. She kept wiping the same spot on the counter for a long time before she finally spoke. "Ethan, you've been so good to me," she said, voice low and careful. "But I don't want you to feel like you have to stay here because of me. The shop is barely making rent these days, and that new chain store down the block is taking customers. You have that instructor position they offered you at the training center. It's a real step up, better pay, regular hours, less of the hard calls that keep you up at night. You should take it." I felt the words land like a weight I hadn't seen coming. "Is that what you want?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She finally looked at me, eyes shiny with tears. She was trying hard not to let fall. "I want you to have a future that isn't tied to a girl who can't even keep her own shop from falling apart some months. I'm not the kind of person people build lives around. My ex made that clear enough before he left. He said my small dreams were holding him back from bigger things. I don't want to do that to you too. You deserve someone who can give you more than late nights in a struggling plant shop." I tried to tell her she was wrong, that being with her was the first time in years the job didn't feel so heavy on my shoulders, that I wasn't looking for perfect or easy. But she shook her head and said the words that stayed with me for weeks afterward. "You should go, Ethan. Don't throw away something real for someone like me. I'll be okay. I always am." I left that night because I didn't know how to stay when she was asking me to leave. I told myself she was protecting herself, that maybe she needed space, that I was just the guy who happened to return her wallet and stayed for one dinner. 2 weeks later, I accepted the instructor position and started packing up my small apartment. The drive to the training facility felt longer than it should have. Every mile I put between us made the quiet in the car feel heavier, and I kept thinking about the way she hummed when she was focused, and how her hand felt in mine when we walked to the supply store together. In the new city, the work was steadier, the hours more predictable, the respect from the trainees genuine, but at night, when I sat alone in the small apartment they gave me, all I could think about was the smell of basil and damp soil, the way Clara hummed when she was focused on something, and how sitting in her shop after a long shift had felt like the first real peace I'd had in years. I kept the photo from her wallet saved on my phone and the pressed violet in my wallet. I didn't call. I didn't text. I told myself it was what she had wanted, and that I was doing the right thing by respecting her, with choice. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw her standing in the back room with dirt on her cheek, and that small smile when she asked me to stay for dinner. Back in Harbor's Edge, The shop was struggling more than she let on. Her closest friend Lena, who ran the little bakery 2 doors down, kept checking in on her. But Clara just smiled and said everything was fine. One afternoon after Clara had spent the morning in the back room trying not to cry because another plant order had been delayed and she couldn't cover the electric bill on time, Lena had enough. She found my number from an old group message and called me while I was between classes at the training center. "Ethan, I don't know exactly what happened between you two," Lena said, her voice firm but kind. "But you need to come back. Clara's been pretending she's okay, but she's not. She pushed you away because she thought she was protecting you, same way she always does when she's scared of losing something important. She thinks she's doing you a favor by letting you go, but she's miserable. And that shop, it's everything to her. If you still care about her, don't let her talk herself into believing she's better off alone. She needs you, even if she's too stubborn to say it right now." I didn't even finish the rest of my shift. I told my supervisor there was a family emergency and drove straight through the night, stopping only for gas and coffee that tasted like regret. By the time I reached Harbor's Edge, the rain was coming down hard again, the same steady sheets as the night I first returned her wallet. I went straight to Root and Bloom. The closed sign was up, but through the window, I could see her sitting on the floor between 2 big fiddle leaf figs, head in her hands, like the weight of everything had finally caught up with her. I knocked on the glass. She looked up slowly, and even from outside I could see the shock and the hope fighting each other on her face. She stood and came to the door, unlocking it with hands that shook a little. "I only came to return something," I said when she opened it, my voice rough from the long drive. I held out the small notebook she had lent me weeks earlier, the one filled with her careful plant care notes and little drawings in the margins. It was the only excuse I could think of on the drive back. She stared at it, then at me, and the tears she had been holding back finally slipped down her cheeks. "Ethan, I know what you said that night," I told her, stepping inside and closing the door behind us. The shop smelled exactly like I remembered, soil and herbs and the faint sweetness of whatever she had baked earlier. "I know you thought you were doing the right thing by pushing me away, but you were wrong. The only thing I've wanted since the night I walked in here with your wallet is to be where you are. Even if the shop is hard some days, even if things get messy, I'm not your ex. I'm not going to leave because it isn't perfect or easy." She covered her mouth with one hand, crying openly now, and I pulled her into my arms the way I had that night after the bad call. She came without hesitation, pressing her face into my chest like she had been waiting for this moment as long as I had. "I was so scared," she whispered against my shirt. "I thought if I let you stay, you'd eventually hate me for holding you back. I thought letting you go was the only way to love you right. I didn't want to be the reason you gave up something better. You don't get to decide my future for me," I said into her hair, holding her tighter. "Not even when you think you're protecting me. I choose you. I choose this. All of it. The shop, the late nights, the hard days. I choose you every single time." We stood there for a long time, while the rain hammered on the roof and the plants around us stayed, quiet and steady. When she finally pulled back enough to look at me, her eyes were red, but clearer than they had been in weeks. "I want you here too," she said, voice soft but certain. "I missed you so much it hurt to breathe some days. I'm sorry I tried to make the choice for both of us. I was wrong. That was the night everything shifted for good. I worked out a deal with the training center so I could do some of the instruction remotely and run local workshops a few times a month, while staying in Harbor's Edge full-time. Clara and I sat down with Lena and a couple of the other shop owners on the block and figured out ways to bring more people through the doors. Weekend plant care classes, a bigger monthly supper club with themes, and eventually turning the back room into a small reading nook and workshop space where I could even teach basic first aid and emergency freeways. Preparedness for the community. It wasn't about me saving the shop. It was about us building something together that felt like it could last, something that combined what we both knew how to do. 6 months later, the shop was doing better than it had in a long time, not because of any one big change, but because we were doing the work side by side, every day. On the nights I wasn't at the station, I'd come in and help her close up. We'd cook dinner together in the tiny kitchen, sometimes just for the two of us, sometimes for a few friends who lingered after the supper nights. We'd eat surrounded by the plants we'd watered and talked to, and watched grow stronger. One evening after everyone had gone home from a small poetry reading we hosted, Clara turned off most of the lights and put on the same old record we had listened to that first night I stayed for dinner. She walked over to where I was wiping down a table and held out her hand. "Stay for another dance?" she asked, that same small smile from the night I returned her wallet playing on her lips. I took her hand and pulled her close, moving slowly with her between the shelves of plants and warm string lights. "I only came to return a wallet," I said against her hair, smiling as the music played soft and low. She laughed, the sound warm and real, and exactly where I wanted to be. "And I only asked you to stay for dinner." We kept dancing as the rain started up again outside, the city moving on around us while inside Root and Bloom, everything felt still and right. Later that night, after the record had ended, and we were sitting at the small table with leftover soup, we talked about the future. Not in big dramatic plans, but in small, real ways. We decided to turn part of the back room into a proper workshop space, where she could teach plant care and I could run monthly first aid classes for families. We talked about maybe expanding the cafe side slowly, adding a few more tables, and hosting author nights once a month. We talked about me eventually moving some of my things into the small apartment above the shop, so I didn't have to drive across town after late shifts. None of it felt like settling. It felt like building something that actually fit. I thought about how one small decision, bringing back something she had lost, had led to finding a place I didn't even know I had been looking for. She had given me somewhere to land after years of carrying other people's hardest moments, and I had given her someone who would stay, even when she tried to make it easy to walk away. Some stories start with grand gestures or perfect timing. Ours started with a wallet on the backseat of a car and an invitation to stay a little longer than what either of us had planned. And every night since, I've been grateful I listened when she asked me to stay for dinner. We still have hard days. The shop still struggles sometimes. My job still brings home heavy things. But we face them together now, and that makes all the difference. Every time I walk through the door of Root and Bloom and see her there, dirt on her cheek and that small smile waiting for me, I remember that sometimes the best things in life start with the simplest words. I only came to return her wallet, and she replied, "Then stay for dinner." And I did. I stayed, and I'm still here.